Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Monica, very much for this kind introduction. I would also like to thank the organizers and CEPS for giving me the excuse to come to Australia for the first time, even though the flight was rather long and I'm still suffering from the jet lag, but still appreciate the opportunity to speak at this wonderful conference. What I want to present to you today is my research on the role of private sector actors in the fight against terrorism. And in particular, I will be focusing on the role of private financial institutions in the fight against terrorist financing. But moving on from the lessons from this case study, I want to also generalize and speak more generally about public-private partnerships in the fight against terrorism. As in the case of the EU's counterterrorism policy, I will be a skeptic, and I will be arguing that rather than being a silver bullet, they are either public-private dictatorships or at least they are marriages of convenience rather than partnerships. By the way of introduction, I should say that my background is not in criminology, it's in IR and in international security. And in these two disciplines, relatively little has been, until recently at least, written and research about the role of private actors. The so-called private-public divide seems to be looming quite heavily in these two fields, and this is especially the case in the study of terrorism and counterterrorism, which is almost exclusively focused on the role of public actors. There has been quite a bit written about the role of public-private partnerships in several other areas that could be included in international security. In security studies, perhaps the biggest focus, as Monica Dember has already outlined, was and is on private military and security companies, but this view has been rather critical and it has been limited to the military operations of the so-called US war on terror, rather than on other private sector actors, which I call the regular businesses that don't do security for profit, and this is the focus of my research. The one area where the so-called public-private partnerships have received the most attention is the literature on homeland security and critical infrastructure protection. And I know my colleagues will be talking much more about the details of what a public-private partnership is, what is the definition, how does this evolve over time. So I will just limit myself to saying that in the area of homeland security, or more generally in the fight against terrorism, public-private partnerships have a rather different focus than the traditional 1980s public management theories focus, which was to enhance efficiency of both the private sector, but even more importantly of public administration, so that it can produce better results than previously. In contrast, in the context of counterterrorism, the primary focus of public-private partnerships is not on enhancing efficiency or preparing public sector for privatization. It is supposed to enhance security. And I will be arguing later on that this may be actually one of the problems or one of the reasons why it hasn't worked that well. Very briefly, an introduction to what is the fight against terrorist financing and what is the role of private actors in it. The logic here is quite straightforward. Terrorists, as anyone else, need money. And therefore, if we can deprive them of the money, we can stop some of the future terrorist attacks. From the police investigations, we can also follow the money trail and therefore disrupt the already existing networks. How this is done in practice, this varies slightly from country to country, but it is possible to identify two basic models, the so-called smart sanctions model, which has been especially advanced by the UN Security Council. This is essentially based on the idea of blacklists or terrorist lists, where people and organizations are listed after, usually based on secret intelligence supplied by the member states of the UN, with the aim that all of their financial assets should be frozen precisely so that they cannot continue with their illegal terrorist activities. The second model is the so-called anti-money laundering model. This has been advanced by the Financial Action Task Force, a body associated with G8, which has composed 40 specific recommendations, and after 9/11, 9 specific recommendations to fight terrorist financing. The logic here is essentially the old organized crime money laundering idea. If the terrorists already have money, how do we stop them from using it, from moving it from one bank to another? What is important and what I'm focusing on in my research is that in both of these models, the crucial role, or what I call the first line responders, is actually private financial institutions. Not just private financial institutions, but primarily private financial institutions. It can be seen in this sort of reverse pyramid, which I borrowed from a Belgian colleague of mine, that basically at the front line, you have the regular employees of banks who are supposed to essentially monitor the customers of private financial institutions for what they call suspicious behavior, to make sure that any people or organizations that are on these blacklists or that have otherwise made suspicious transactions by sending large amounts of money, sending them to suspicious people, sending them to suspicious destinations, etc., that these are actually reported then to the so-called Financial Intelligence Unit, the FYUs, whose legal nature and powers differs from country to country, but whose basic role is then to go over these so-called suspicious transaction reports and verify whether they are indeed somehow related to terrorist financing, and if so, then the pyramid further narrows. This goes on to be passed to the police and to the courts, which ultimately should sentence the bad guys and send them to jail. So in theory, this looks pretty simple and straightforward. In practice, however, this has not worked as originally expected. And the reason why is because the private sector has adjusted or adopted what I call a phenomenon of defensive overcompliance, or if I should use quote from my interviews, cover their back or ass policies, which is basically reporting everything that looks even marginally suspicious to the Public Financial Intelligence Unit. The problem is that on paper this may look very efficient. If you look at some of the data, which by the way is quite difficult to get because many countries consider it to be secret, but if you look at the number of suspicious transaction reports for selected countries, you see a steady increase since the 1990s and a major hike after 9/11, so that in the US, for example, we are now receiving over 1 million suspicious transaction reports per year. Now the problem is that this has not necessarily translated into effectiveness. That is to actual freezing of terrorist assets or to locking large numbers of terrorists behind bars. I will present just the data on the first. This is cumulative worldwide frozen assets of terrorist organizations. You can see that there has been a big increase after 9/11, but after these initial successes and then the decrease, this is due to the return of some money to the Afghan government after Afghanistan was liberated from the Taliban regime. You see that it has been pretty much steady. So again, if you contrast the increases in the suspicious transaction reports with the relatively steady amount of frozen terrorist assets, you see that already something there is not exactly right. What is perhaps even more problematic from the public perspective is that the high number of suspicious transaction reports actually makes the life of the Public Financial Intelligence Unit more difficult. And this is because out of all of these suspicious transaction reports, only a small percentage, and again it differs from country to country, but generally the percentage is very small, as you can see here on the data for Germany, of those which are actually linked to terrorist financing. So basically, the more data private financial institution reports, the more stuff the financial intelligence units have to cover. And in most countries, these units do not have more than a handful of people. So the idea that, for example, in the UK, the 12 people which are working in the financial intelligence office full-time can cover more than the 100,000 of suspicious transaction reports is, to me, just beyond comprehension. So obviously, the theory and practice in the fight against terrorist financing has been different, and my argument is that this is because we haven't really appreciated the role incentives of the private financial institutions. Firstly, I would argue that there is a problem with the data and with the methodology. The banks are expected to adopt a risk management model, which is not something that they are not familiar with. The problem is that this is increasingly, or I would say from the beginning, impossible to imply in the context of counterterrorism. Why? Firstly, something that we as academicians are also faulty with, and this is that we still cannot agree on what terrorism is. This is the endless debate on what is one's freedom fighter is another man's terrorists. We also are not quite sure what is the difference between money laundering and terrorist financing. although one of the models is based on the idea that it's the same logic. Terrorists have frequently used what could be called clean money to do dirty things, which is very different from the dirty money laundered by organized crime for legal activities. There is also lack of data on how much money is exactly laundered worldwide. There are some estimates, but without solid data, and more or less also importantly data for individual institutions, they cannot make the usual risk management calculation. That is to basically make the assessment how much money would they lose if they indeed are abused by terrorists for financial purposes. It is also not clear how financial institutions are supposed to identify suspicious transactions. The advice that is given by public authorities is quite vague. These are the famous limits that you should not be sending more than 9,999 euros, for example, in Europe, if you don't want your transactions to receive extra attention, because anything above 10,000 euros gets more attention than this limit. But obviously, this is arbitrary. The same arbitrary criteria are whether you are sending it to suspicious destinations. For example, the Middle East has been declared in general as a suspicious destination. So it just covers a lot of ground. And finally, as I already mentioned, the private institutions for whom this is a cost have not invested heavily, but still the compliance departments, their capacities are rather limited. The second problem is that there is lack of information sharing. And from the very beginning, the idea of public-private partnerships is to actually facilitate information sharing. But again, in the area of counterterrorism, this has not really been forthcoming. First, the problem is that there are simply way too many private financial institutions to make this effective. And moreover, in the fight against terrorism at the international level, it's as strong and as weak as the weakest link in the chain. So it takes just one Seychelles Islands, one bad bank, if you want to call it in that way, to ruin the entire system. If you also look at the amount of daily financial transactions, these are in billions of transactions daily, transferring hundreds of billions of money. Obviously, the banks will tell you, even with the best intelligence, with the best automated systems in our computers, some leakage is statistically unavoidable. Given the amount of the money that's transferred every day, this leakage will be in the area of hundreds of millions of US dollars. It doesn't take more than a few thousand or tens of thousands of dollars to do the Madrid terrorist bombing, the London terrorist bombings, etc. So the costs, or the operational costs at least, of terrorist attacks have been rather low, while this leakage by nature is much higher than these numbers. There are also legal impediments to sharing information between public and private actors. As I mentioned, for example, the terrorist lists are entirely compiled based on secret information supplied by the member states. This obviously has generated a lot of criticism, especially in Europe, also court trials, and this hasn't exactly encouraged the private financial institutions either to be really forthcoming in implementing some of the regulations simply because they don't have the right information, or at least they claim so. And there are also internal shortcomings of both the UN smart sanctions model and the anti-money laundering model. I've already mentioned that it is a little bit disputed whether really anti-money laundering is the same as fighting against terrorist financing. In the case of the terrorist list, there is very huge criticism on human rights grounds on how people get actually listed and delisted from these lists, but I don't have the time to go into details in my presentation. Thirdly, and in my opinion most problematically, there is what I call the profit versus security dilemma. In security studies or in the security governance literature, there is increasingly a talk that nowadays private and public actors interchange, interact in what is called new security spaces, global security assemblages, etc. But the problem is that that doesn't necessarily mean that the objectives of private actors are the same as the objective of public, especially security actors. Why not? Ultimately, the private sector is still profit rather than security oriented. And this to me is the single biggest obstacle, because we can perhaps fix data methodology, we can perhaps improve information sharing, but we simply cannot change the nature of the private financial institutions. They are there to make money, and it doesn't mean that they don't care about security, but still money comes first. And thus, to most banks, as to most other private sector actors, the fight against terrorism means an extra cost. and a cost which is somehow to be covered from the regular profit line that they still have to make. Banks especially face two kinds of costs: direct costs if they are penalized for not reporting enough. There have been, and you can see it in the table, some pretty heavy penalties imposed on banks, but even more importantly, what they worry about is reputational loss, because you do not want to be associated as a bank with being anyhow accused of supporting terrorist financing. As you can see in the case of the first bank on this list, some banks have indeed went bankrupt because they have been singled out as supporters or not doing enough in the fight against terrorism. So this is the biggest headache that private financial institutions have, the reputational cost in that. So this has been the story or the case study of private financial institutions. What does it mean for the fight against terrorism in general? I would argue this means that we should be rather skeptical about the role of public-private partnerships. And the overall explanation to me, or the best one I can find other than this profit versus security dilemma, is that actually private institutions or private actors actually have four options when it comes to national and international security. They can either take the risk and hope that it will simply not occur. They can also take the risk and seek insurance, which is, again, basically to cover the financial losses that they may get if the security risk materializes. They also have the third option, which is the only option, in my opinion, for public authorities to actually address the risk directly. And they also have the option to simply go out of business if they feel that the risk is out of line compared to the cost that they would have to invest with dealing with so. Now, why most private actors will not take option number 3? That is once again the option that most public security agencies simply have to take by definition. Some people have argued that perhaps since 9/11, private financial institutions should live in a world which they call corporate security responsibility. Terrorism is affecting all of us, not just the public agencies, but every citizen, also the private institutions. And therefore, as with private corporate social responsibility, they should be caring about security as well. Now, the problem from my interviews is that most banking officials make a strong distinction between what is called safety and security. And they see safety, that is that people pay off their mortgages, that they are not abusing their credit cards, etc., as something that they have always done. But at the same time, they feel that terrorism and many other security issues are supposed to be dealt with the public agencies, not with the private sector. This is especially the case in terrorism, which is seen as being, and one of the definitions, the traditional ones, is indeed the use of violence for political purposes. Therefore, they see this as politics, to which the private sector is by definition external, and therefore, again, that it's the responsibility of the government and not of the private sector. It is also the case that at the individual level, that is the chances of a particular bank being abused for terrorist financing or being a victim of a terrorist attack, statistically, this is rather low. That's why, once again, some banks may be hesitant to invest much, if anything. And finally, as I already mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, unlike private military and security companies, which are the only private sector actors which actually make profit out of security solutions, banks actually do not make money by providing security or fight against terrorist financing. So to conclude, instead of being the much desired silver bullet in the fight against terrorist financing, I would argue that public-private partnerships are more akin, and again I will be quoting some of the banking officials that I interviewed, that they are either forced marriages, one-way streets, burden passing, or dictatorships from the public sector to the private sector. Obviously, I am aware that neither the public nor the private sector can do it alone, but unless we can prove, at least from some other areas of the fight against terrorism, that public-private partnership works, I would be rather skeptical of advancing this line of argument in support of the fight against terrorism. So thank you for your attention. Questions, complaints, very welcome.